Okay, so this video is for my general biology class on community ecology, and I'm going to mainly focus on different species interactions. When we talk about what community ecology is, it's a study of different populations of species interacting together in an ecosystem. And so we'll talk about the impacts they have on one another. But first, before we get started, we're going to go ahead and talk about two vocabulary words, habitat versus niche. And a habitat is primarily the location of where you find organisms, where you find a certain species and where they can kind of like handle living, which like what is their range of where you find them. A habitat could also imply like where in particular species of birds build their nests, like that would be their habitat, versus a niche is going to be the ecological role the organism plays within the greater ecosystem. And so it's not just like a location, but rather it's role. I don't know another way to say that. And so if we think about this frog, for example, its ecological niche is that it requires fresh water. It's going to eat insects and help keep insect populations in check while also being prey for larger secondary consumers or tertiary consumers. And it is a nocturnal organism. And so when you look at it uses like plants for camouflage, right? So it competes with other frog species for insects, like all of the aspects of how it uses both biotic and abiotic factors within its ecosystem is its ecological niche or niche. And so when we talk about defining an organism's like habitat or niche, there is a certain range of tolerance, like where you can find them on our planet. And so if we use these fish, for example, there's like an optimum temperature or pH of water that they prefer and are like happiest at. And then if the temperature gets too hot or too cold or the pH gets too alkaline or too acidic, it causes some stress in their physiology, so like the release of cortisol hormone, for example. And then eventually it gets too extreme, and that is what we call the zone of intolerance. So organisms, their habitat will most likely fall into this optimum range. And then there could be changes in the environment, whether it's climate change or acid rain or ocean acidification, that might push the organism into a little bit of physiological stress. And then if the environment changes too much, well, then the organisms just won't be found there. So there's like an example of some lakes in the United States that are so acidic from acid rain that you just generally don't find life. There's no fish that can survive that acidic environment. That would be the zone of intolerance. Now we could also use coral as our example. So coral is an animal that actually relies on a second species of zooplankton. And so you have this coral and a protist, ideally, and they live together in what's called a mutualistic relationship. It's a type of symbiosis that we'll discuss later. Now, these protists that live within the coral that the coral depend on are very sensitive to their temperature. And so they have an optimum range of temperature that they prefer. And the oceans with climate change right now are warming and occasionally have what's called like a marine heat wave. Like we have heat waves on land, it also occurs in our oceans. And when the ocean temperatures, the water gets too hot, these protists that the coral depend on will leave. It's out of their like tolerance. And so therefore we end up with a coral reef that has been bleached. And now it's not really bleached, right? It's just because their mutualistic partner has left. It's too warm for them. And then we have the collapse of the coral reef ecosystem. And so when we now talk more about different species interacting, though, you can see here in this coral reef, there's lots of different species that interact together. But we're going to focus on a forest ecosystem. And so if we look at different animals and organisms and their interactions, that is basically community ecology. So a first one that we've mentioned earlier in like population ecology are predator-prey relationships. With predator-prey relationships, the two species greatly influence each other, right? So if we look at this graph here and we think about, well, which of these lines, A or B, represents the predator and which one represents the prey? Well, line A is going to represent the prey species, and line B is the predator. Now, when we think about this, as the prey population increases, there's more food available for the predator, so then the predator population will also increase. But as the predator population increases, there's more predators eating the prey, so then the prey population declines. And as the prey population declines, well, then the predators are out of food, and there's more intense intra-specific competition. Intra-specific competition is when individuals from the same species compete for a limited resource. So you have more intra-specific competition, like in this case, an owl versus an owl, and therefore there's less food available per owl, so their population declines. And as their population declines, well, then the prey species is like, heck yeah, I don't have any predators, or as many predators, and then their reproduction occurs, and then their populations increase. And this cycles throughout time. And so these two species definitely affect one another. Now, one characteristic of a prey population that's kind of important is that they have a fast reproductive rate. They're going to have lots of offspring when they do reproduce, and then have short reproductive cycles. And so that's one way they can like quickly repopulate after the population has declined. If it was like an elephant or something who's pregnant for 2 years, it would be a much slower increase over that time. Okay, now that was intra-specific competition. Now, if we talk about inter-specific competition, this is going to be between two different species competing for the same limited resource. So owls aren't the only organism that hunts for rodents or mice or squirrels or whatever. We also have other types of birds, right? So you're going to have hawks, peregrine falcons, snakes. There's going to be other organisms, coyotes, that are going to hunt for the small rodents. When you have two different species competing for the same limited resource, we call this inter-specific competition. So intra was like owl versus owl or snake versus snake. Inter-specific competition is two different species, owl versus snake, competing for the same limited resource. So individuals of different species compete for a resource that limits their growth and survival. Now, when we really think about this, we can symbolize this with like a negative and a negative, because the owl population and the snake population, when they're competing with each other, they don't do as well. It's like makes it harder to find food. So it's like a negative relationship between the owl and the snake. It makes it difficult for both of them to reach their full potential carrying capacity, for example. So if we look at some like experiments that have been done on different species, especially fast-growing species in like petri dishes and things. If you have species 1 grown on its own, it'll eventually reach carrying capacity. Species 2 also will undergo exponential growth, eventually reach carrying capacity. However, if you grow these two species together, let's say they're two different species of bacteria, or maybe they're little like protists in a limited water like tank environment, for example. But if you grow two species together, neither one will reach its full potential. One of the species will outcompete the other. No two species can occupy the exact same ecological niche at the exact same time. It is not sustainable or possible for two different species to hunt for food at the same time, to use the same shelter at the same time, to compete for water at the same time and in the same way. If you have two different species trying to use every aspect of their ecological niche at the same time, one of them is going to be a better competitor and will outcompete the other. And so this is what we call the competitive exclusion principle. And so the competitive exclusion principle, put my face here, is an ecological principle stating that when two species attempt to occupy the same niche, only one outcome is possible. One species will drive the other out. Now, I don't have this as part of this video, but in other ones, I have this could lead to or may lead to what's called resource partitioning. And in resource partitioning, two species who initially maybe occupy the same ecological niche will actually evolve to kind of share resources. And so if you have two different birds eating insects in a particular species of tree, what may happen is they may evolve where one species is going to live in the top of the tree and eat insects from up there or seeds from up there, and the second species will evolve to use the bottom part of the tree. So in resource partitioning, they kind of divide the habitat into different sections, and therefore they can coexist. Okay. Or one will emigrate and have to be like forced out of the area. Now, another type of interaction is herbivory. Now, herbivory is similar to predator-prey, except for the prey are plants, and the plants can't leave, right? They're rooted in place. And so herbivore populations do have impacts on plant populations. However, plants have evolved different defenses, right? We have like spicy foods or peppers that grow. We have spines on cactus or pine needles on pine trees. Pine trees also have like resin in them that make them hard to digest. So plants do evolve protective mechanisms against herbivory, but these are two different interacting populations on one another. And then the last one I'm going to talk about in this video is the keystone species. The keystone species is a species that has a very large, disproportionate impact on the ecosystem and its biomass. And so the species, when I say disproportionate, what I mean is it doesn't take a lot of them. A famous example is the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone National Park. If you're on YouTube watching this, I highly recommend you search up how wolves change rivers. It's about a 5-minute video and will very clearly explain the importance of a keystone species. It's actually what I show in my class and why I don't have more on my PowerPoint about the topic. And so a keystone species, though, basically holds the whole ecosystem and trophic levels and amounts of other organisms in balance. And so when you remove the keystone species, it causes huge disruptions. So for example, in the wolves of Yellowstone, when they were absent for 70 years, and when they were reintroduced into the ecosystem, or when they were gone, the elk population increased exponentially. Out like overgrazing the plants, and as the elk population underwent exponential growth, that meant less primary producers for other herbivores. So other herbivore populations declined, which meant less food for your secondary consumers. And basically this exponential growth of elk caused negative impacts on a number of other species and their population sizes. By reintroducing the wolves, they only brought in 10 wolves. It brought the elk population down, which meant more plants, which meant other species populations increased. And it was all due to that one species, the keystone species. Now, sea otters are also a keystone species. Sea otter populations keep urchins in check. They are the predator of urchins. And urchins like to feed on kelp forests or on kelp. So when you remove otters, the urchin population undergoes exponential growth and decimates the kelp forest. It eats the roots of kelp, they're not roots, but the holdfasts, how kelp attach to the ground. And it basically is like equal to deforestation. It like clears the kelp forest, and all the thousands of species that depend on kelp as their home are now lost. And so the sea otters, that one species, is critical to the whole biodiversity of the kelp forests. Now, there are other concepts in community ecology, one of those being, so here's a nice little graph about keystone species. When we think about the dependent variable here, the keystone species, when they're present, the whole ecosystem has a higher amount of biodiversity. When you remove them, that biodiversity declines. Now, there's two more topics in community ecology. We have symbiosis and ecological succession. I already have separate videos on those, so I will link them here. But I'm going to end this video now, and I recommend you finish off with my symbiosis video as well as my primary versus secondary succession to round out your review of community ecology. All right, great job.